Assalamu alaikum, my dear participants. We are now about to begin our study session. And as you all know, we study some texts in the first part of this segment. And then in the second segment, we discuss a common misconception relating to Islam. The text that we're going to discuss today is being displayed before you. You can see it's primarily the first text that we're going to discuss is from the Quran. It is verse 25 from Surah Hadid. It's one of the very important verses which actually delineates the purpose of sending divine books, and as such has a very important message to relate to us. So I'm just going to read out the verse and its translation before you, and then we will have a short discussion on this verse. So the words are وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. And with these messengers we sent down our book, which is the judge between right and wrong, so that through it people are able to adhere to justice regarding what is the truth. So you can see, dear viewers, that primarily this verse, and we have some similar verses as well, which have exactly the same subject which they discuss. It says that the primary reason of sending down divine books with God's messengers is that people are able to adhere to the truth regarding religion. And of course, this is very understandable. The Quran is the final book of the Almighty. Before the Quran, we know that there have been a number of other books, and for the foremost book and perhaps the most complete of them is the Old Testament or the Torah, which was given to Prophet Moses. And before Moses as well, we know that there were other prophets of God who received these books, but their books have not survived. Some of them have, but as I said, their survival is primarily in the form of translations. We don't have their original language with us. So this is the final book of the Almighty, the final book of God, the final testament of God, if we can say. And the biggest difference between this testament and the previous books is that it has been preserved in its original language. We find it to be with us in the very form that it was revealed. The Old and the New Testaments also are books of God, and they contain a lot of wisdom. They contain a lot of truth that we can learn from, but their original languages have been lost, and they do not exist in their original languages. We have with us is their translation. So, as far as this verse is concerned, it says that the Quran is the mizan, and we know that mizan means a scale, which of course means that people can weigh their religious ideas in this scale, and then the purpose of the scale is that it will tell you what is right and what is wrong. And also, it needs to be understood that as far as the scale is concerned, nothing can overrule or override what the book says, the book of God says. So not only the purpose of divine books is that they set right our direction, and they set right differences that previous denominations had, but also since it is the mizan, it is the scale, it is also the decisive word of God, and there can be nothing which can overrule this word of God. There can be nothing, no hadith, no historical anecdote, nothing of the sort can overrule or override the implications and the purport of the Quran. So primarily, the purpose is that whenever there is a difference of opinion regarding religious issues, of course, we have to be careful that the verse is specifically talking about religious issues. It's just talking about issues in which people have a different interpretation or conflicting interpretation of a verse or an idea relating to religion. So the primary reason of the Quran is it says that if you present your differences, which may be your interpretive differences, or there may be differences regarding views that have been formed exterior to the Quran, if they are presented before the Quran is bound to guide them. The Quran is bound to correct them. And that is why, dear viewers, this Quran holds such primary importance in religion. it is of paramount significance that it has been preserved in its original language, and that is why we can clearly see that if there is a difference in any sort, if there is a difference not only in our ideas, but also there is a difference in our concepts, the Quran is there to guide us. We have to consult the Quran, and we have to regard the Quran as the ultimate decree of God, in which the final verdict of God regarding a particular issue, which of course deals with religion, will be delineated. And also, let me tell you, dear viewers, as you must yourself might have noted in your own study, that as far as these issues are concerned, primarily these issues, one of the areas of these issues is our faith and the way we have to believe in God. So, thus, for example, the attributes of God. How do we know? How do we connect with God? What are the attributes of God? How can we have a deep relationship with God? So, if there is this concern amongst us in which we find out how we have to do so from the Quran, we'll find a very, very specific guidance. Other than that, we can see in history how people have tried to connect with God and how they have ended up, because this connection is primarily based on their own ideas, they're based on their own ijtihad or based on their own endeavor without finding out what God Himself has told us regarding this connection. We can see from history how this has really been a cause of huge confusion, and people have ended up in extremes by not acknowledging the attributes of God, by not actually finding out what the Almighty Himself has decreed. Just to give an example, how much we should worship Him, we can see there have been extremes. People have gone to such extremes as we can see in asceticism, in which people have actually given up this world, and they have forsaken this world, and they think that this world is something which is going to lead them astray, and this is something which is going to distract them. So, if you consult the Quran, you'll find out that this is certainly not what is required by the Almighty. Forsaking the world, leaving the world, and completely devoting oneself to religion or to the Almighty is not what the Quran wants. So you see, you can clearly see that it's one of the few areas which I've just described before you, in which the Quran gives us a very clear-cut guidance. It says that we have to live in this world, we have to contribute in this world, we have to fully give attention to the needs of this world. However, whenever there is a clash between our worldly requirements and our next worldly requirements, the Quran says that we have to give preference to the next worldly requirements. It does not say that you have to forsake this world. It does not at all say that these worldly pleasures they must not be enjoyed in any sense. On the other hand, it says you have to fully benefit. These pleasures have been, in fact, been created by the Almighty for our benefit, for our amusement. And the only thing is that overindulgence, of course, is something that should be avoided. And if there is a clash between our responsibilities, which relate to morality or the hereafter or the requisites which the Almighty has ordained in us, then we have to give preference to this. So, in each and every sphere of religion, wherever there is this difference of opinion, whether it is Tawheed, whether it is the concept of prophethood, it's the concept of hereafter, it is the concept of governing ourselves in this world or conducting ourselves in this world, or similarly, very other small affairs as family life, the issues which relate to family life, similarly issues which relate to state, which relate to our economy. We have a complete answer from the Almighty in these differences. And these differences, of course, they have to be, when we say that the Quran gives us a solution or its own verdict, it does mean that we have to use our intellect, we have to use our insight, we have to use our understanding to get to that answer. So, but the beautiful thing, my dear viewers, that you can see is that it gives us the courage, it gives us this clear understanding that we can adopt what we think, if we are sincere in our quest, what we think is God's view. So in our quest, we are given this definite stature or this definite position in which we can totally rely and think that when we are consulting the Quran And as per our own understanding, we are actually trying to gain what the Almighty has said. We are trying to access the will of God in these differences. But the point of caution here is that we have to give the Quran this status in which the differences people have regarding religion, they must be presented before the Quran. They should not be, the caution is that it is not to be presented, these differences are not meant to be presented before, for example, some revered personalities, or for example, history or hadith. There is no other place to go regarding our differences but to the Quran. We have to consult the Quran. It starts with the Quran, it ends with the Quran. Unless and until we depend on the Quran in each of our differences, of course, there is this huge chance that these differences will never get resolved. So it's basically a great favor of the Almighty that when He sent His last book, He preserved that book in its original, in its final form. There is no adulteration in this book. The book has been preserved in its original language. The book is with us in the same form as it was revealed, and the book provides definitive guidance, substantive guidance regarding differences that people may have. So it's just a question of we consulting the book, of we depending on the book. And as I've said repeatedly, my dear viewers, that this is something which has to become a habit with us. We have to keep a good translation of the Quran at our bedside. We don't need to go anywhere except to the Quran. Whenever we find that there is some question that we have regarding religion, we can consult the Quran. And other than that, the Quran has to become a daily part of our lives. It has to become a daily habit of our lives. Reading it with a good translation for 5 or 10 minutes is something which is essentially required, because not only does it answer a lot of questions, I always say that it is the biggest means of connecting ourselves with the Almighty. All of us are weak individuals. All of us need the support. Every other support is temporary. The only support which is permanent is the Almighty. We have to connect ourselves to the Almighty. We have to depend on the Almighty. We have to rely on the Almighty. And I do often say this, that we have to talk to the Almighty. It's like whispering to the Almighty. And I do imagine that when we whisper to the Almighty, we do feel this, that He is hearing what we are saying. And at times also we feel that there is a reply coming our way. So this is a primary need, and other than that, as I said, this is a need that we can all acknowledge. But the basic purpose of divine books, which has been established and which has been clearly said in this verse, is that we have to settle all our differences by consulting the Quran. It has to be the Quran all the way. And as I often say, we have to return to the scripture, we have to return to the Quran, we have to leave everything aside. When I say leave everything aside, of course, it does not mean that we have to forsake everything aside, but it means that it has to be subservient to the Quran. The Quran has to rule over every other religious idea that we get, and we have to accept the verdict of the Quran wherever we may find it. Because now we move on to the next part of our segment here, the first segment, and we are now going to study a famous hadith of the Prophet. And this hadith actually has been taken out from the Jami Sahih of Imam Muslim. And the words are, the hadith has been reported by Abu Huraira. The words are, An Abi Huraira an Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam قال لا يستر عبد عبدا في الدنيا إلا ستره الله يوم القيامة. I think it's a very, very pertinent hadith regarding our interpersonal relationships. And a simple translation of this hadith is that Abu Huraira reported that the Prophet said, on the day of judgment, God will conceal the faults of that person who conceals the faults of others in this world. So, dear viewers, you can clearly see how the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has inspired us, that instead of exploiting the weaknesses, instead of giving an advertisement of weaknesses of other people, he wants us to hide the weaknesses of other people. Because, of course, if you hide these weaknesses, there is always a chance that that person is going to mend his ways. He is going to do he is going to end up as a person who has this urge and will to make up for these blemishes. Of course, there is a word of caution here that this hadith does not relate to people who are habitual criminals or people who have taken to criminal life. It's not related to that particular aspect. Of course, such people need to be reported. These people need to be taken to task. This actually, this narrative actually relates to small blemishes that we all do, and they emanate from us. And at times, they even are a cause of bringing our personality into disrepute. For example, we know that there was a case in the times of the Prophet when a person, a very pious person, was guilty of fornication or adultery, and someone wanted to report what that person had become guilty of. And you know what the Prophet said? He said that it is a blemish that you must hide. It is a mistake that can emanate from even a pious person. So why do you want such a person who is basically a person who is virtuous, basically a person who is upright? Why do you want to expose this weakness? Because if you do so, it will become a stigma on his personality forever. It's not going to go away from him. So the teaching which he meant for us to gather from this was that these faults, they need to be hidden from people. Of course, when we mean that we hide these faults from people, the purpose is that when we hide these faults from the people, and at the same time, we also would like that person, that he overcome these faults. Then instead of speaking of his faults in public, one of our duties is that as far as we can, in an appropriate manner, and of course, using all the wisdom that we have, we should try in our personal capacity, if there is a possibility, to correct the person's fault, maybe as a well wisher. If we are a well wisher of that person, I can assure you he or she is going to welcome whatever we have said. But if we start exploiting his weaknesses, exposing them in public, there is a very little chance that he or she is going to set right or mend the affairs of whatever they've done wrong. So it's going to be counterproductive, unless, of course, as I said, if the person under discussion is a habitual criminal of some sort, then he needs to be exposed, and he even needs to be actually reported. But a pious person who has maybe done something wrong, or even if he is guilty of doing something wrong in a rather habitual fashion, but he still feels that remorse and guilt, and he would like to get over it with it, then it is best that we do not expose him. Instead, we create this atmosphere of trust between ourselves. Of course, we must also not forget that when we are hiding the faults of others, we must not feel very superior and arrogant that we are doing something as if that if we are hiding the faults of some other person, then we are far superior to him. That is not the case. On the other hand, it's very likely that there are faults that we, of course, have, and we also need those faults to be hidden, and we should make our own personal effort to overcome those faults, to make a concerted effort to overcome those faults. So if we are hiding some other person's faults, we must understand that the same thing, if we deserve the same thing, we are worthy of the same thing, we might be also being passing through the same situation, and we have our own faults. We would never like those faults to get exposed, and we would like them to remain between us and the Almighty. And at the same time, we would also try to mend those faults, to set right those faults. And as always, usually we discuss this thing, that we have to be a well-wisher of the other person, and that well-wishing is best expressed if, when we get the chance, we are able to point out to that person how he is doing something wrong. And of course, by telling him that we would like to help him out, and it's not that we consider ourselves to be superior, have our own faults, but we can come together and fight these faults together. We can battle these faults against these faults and do our best to overcome them. As we have also discussed in a number of times, that correcting faults, viewers, is basically through your self realization, through self-actualization, through self-assessment, self-accountability. So, of course, people help when they point out our mistakes. They do help because at times we are not very, very responsive. At times we do not note that we are committing mistakes. However, we do find that when someone points out our faults, that we are doing something which is not on our notice. So we have to be very gracious, very wholehearted to accept these faults if someone points them out, and at the same time make that concerted effort to come out of these faults. And I've often quoted the instance of the famous philosopher and one of the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin. And I think I've pointed this out before as well, that Benjamin Franklin, at a very early age, it is said that he's around 20 or 22, he had he was possessed with this fact that he's going to become a reformed individual. He's going to become a person who's going to get rid of all his faults. And he counted 13 major blemishes, and he said that I'm going to overcome these blemishes, or in other words, 13 positive values which he wanted to adopt in his life. And he made this column in which he made a page in which these 13 values would be written, and then the days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, all the way to Sunday, would be written. And whenever he would violate those values, he would place a black dot before that black value in that particular day. And then, of course, his basic achievement or his basic purpose was that there should be a week in which there would be no black dots on that page, signifying the fact that he has been successful, at least in that week, in not doing something wrong. So it's like, what I'm trying to point out is that, of course, we need to hide the weaknesses of others as we would like our weaknesses to be hidden. But at the same time, it's not just hiding weaknesses. There is a step ahead to this, and that is trying to rectifying those weaknesses, trying to rectifying our mistakes, and no better a way out in this than to judge ourselves, to hold ourselves accountable every day before going to bed, and trying our best not to repeat these blemishes the next day. Viewers, now let's move on to the third part of our segment, the first segment, and this is the Bible verse of the day. The verse that I have chosen is being displayed before you. It is chapter number 7, verses 3 to 5 from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Let me just read out the words, and please make note of these words. They are simply fantastic, and they really move you as if poetry would, as if anything would, that really has its effect on our soul. So the words are, "And why do you take note of the grain of dust in your brother's eye, but take no note of the bit of wood which is in your eye? Or how will you say to your brother, 'Let me take out the grain of dust from your eye,' when you yourself have a bit of wood in your eye? You false one, first take out the bit of wood from your eye, then will you see clearly to take out the grain of dust from your brother's eye." So the prophet Jesus clearly is trying to point out here is that instead of noticing the faults that other people may have, instead of picking faults of other people, look at your own self. You can notice other people's faults, but the more recommended thing is that you note the fault of your own self. So the verse basically says that, why do you take note of the grain of dust in your brother's eye? Which means, of course, that you pick small faults from others, but the bigger faults that you yourself have, you overlook them. So it's not correct that if you want to really correct someone, it has to be your own self. My dear viewers, this is something which I have often raised in these sessions, that we have to start correcting ourselves. Instead of looking at other people, instead of finding fault with other people, we have to find fault with others. We are very critical of others. It's like having a telescope and a microscope in our hands all the time, through which we judge people, through which we observe people, through which we pick their faults. And many a time we don't even have the data, the complete data. We through half-baked data or maybe unverified data, we start judging people and try to find out faults. And this actually makes us very happy, because we think that we as a result, we are people who don't have these faults that we find in others. It's something which is really unbecoming, and it needs a complete overhauling. It needs a complete change in attitude. I always think that we need to turn that microscope towards our own self. Instead of observing other people through that lens, we should turn that lens to our own selves. We have to find out who we are. We have to find out the problems that we have. We have to find out the this grain of dust in our brother's eye, which is just a grain of dust. But when we look through a microscope at our own self, we find a huge pile of dust in our own eyes, in our own selves. So we have to start with our own selves. Instead of being critical of other people, let us be critical of our own selves. Criticism is something which has to begin with our own selves. And I even go as far as to say it should end also with our own selves, because it is very, very difficult to criticize people in the absence of a lot of data that we might be missing. Often we don't know what the situation of that other person is, and we have a real go at him while criticizing him. So I think this is one area in which we need to follow this beautiful advice which Jesus has given us, or reported to have given us, that we must practice what we preach. If we think that there is something wrong, if we think there is a problem, then it has to be solved. And the way we need to solve it is to start with our own selves. And if we don't do so, I think, then this is what is called self-righteousness. Self-righteousness, of course, is something in which we regard ourselves to be correct and absolutely true, while we always pick faults at others and we think that the other person is always wrong. We have to find out that it is we who need this correction. The Almighty is not going to ask others. He's not going to ask the fate of others or the situation other people went through. He is going to ask ourselves directly. So we have to be ready to answer for our own selves. The Almighty is not going to ask for other people or regarding, He's not going to ask from us what other people did or what they did not do, but He's certainly going to ask us what we could have done and we never did. And we were always trying to find out faults with other society and with other people. I often say that if we have nothing else to say, we start cursing the weather, we start cursing the surroundings. And of course, this is going to take us nowhere. It's not going to correct whatever we think. It's, of course, an attitude of complaining and brooding, which primarily is the product of negative thinking. We have to adopt a positive approach. And the positive approach is that what can we do for the surroundings instead of brooding at what have other people done for us. The positive approach is that we have to correct our own faults instead of finding out the faults of our brethren, of those around us. So, with this, we come to the end of the first segment, my dear viewers, of our study circle. And before we go on to the next segment, in which we are going to discuss a misconception regarding Islam, please let me know if you have any questions regarding what we have studied vis-a-vis the three texts, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Bible. And then, inshallah, we'll continue. So I can see Rafia Khwaja Sahiba, you have your hands raised. You can uh, go ahead with your question. Kindly unmute your mic. It is muted from your side. Yes, it's now unmuted.
Yeah. There is something called constructive criticism. Of course, we look into ourselves first and criticize ourselves also. But when it comes to like family members, children, relatives, or even friends, if you don't criticize something which is positively wrong somebody is doing, then don't you think you're doing harm to the person rather than helping him? I'm not saying constantly criticize every little thing, but I'm talking about generally when you find your own family people doing certain things, or close friends or close relatives, you
So you see,
criticize in a nice way.
right. What I meant to say here, and what I have understood from the Quran and from the Hadith and from the Bible, is that we have to select and choose. First of all, as the Quran says, "Zakkir in naf'ati zikra." You can correct others if you think that the other person is going to listen to you, he is going to give your criticism weight, and of course, it is also couched in very disciplined and very sagacious words. So it's not that you overlook other people's faults. It is just that you find out if the person is responsive to you or not. You find out if the person is going to really benefit from you or not. Because you see, at times people think that you're teasing them or you're hurting them. So these are the things that you need to guard against. I always quote this famous saying from the French poet and philosopher Voltaire. So he used to say that whenever you need to criticize a person, start off by praising him. And when he said start off by praising him, it does not mean that you falsely praise someone. It means that you acknowledge his good points, his good habits, so that the other person starts to feel at ease with you. And when you become at ease with this person, the other person accepts you as your well-wisher, and he or she is still willing to hear to criticism. So you see, criticism is an art. I always say that criticizing someone is an art that we must learn, because this is one thing that all of us do every time. It is something which is happening all the time. We are criticizing our colleagues, our friends, our children, our spouses, our parents. This keeps happening, and there is this art of criticism that we need to learn. And the biggest statute of that art is that we must first become a well wisher of the person that we intend to criticize. The second thing is that we must use words which are most appropriate. At times, our stance is absolutely correct, but we use very harsh words. And of course, that is something which is totally counterproductive. And the third thing is that we are often repetitive in our criticism. That is also not correct. Repetition and criticism is something which, of course, is not going to lead us anywhere. It's just going to make that person react. And then there's another important thing, that we must not base our criticism on hearsay. Often, at times, we hear something about people, and without verifying, we start criticizing that person. And lastly, another thing which I always call as an art of this criticism, is that we must address the person in question directly. Often it happens that we want to criticize a person, and instead of doing it on his face, we do this criticism with other people, and ultimately, because it is done in a closed circle, that critique reaches that person as well, and he gets offended. So instead of talking to other people, which of course at times comes under backbiting and rebirth, what we need to do is find this courage to first make friends with that person, and then politely present your point of view without being insistent and without being repetitive.
Dr. Shehzad, I was thinking personally, my brother used to drink a lot, and because I loved him, I was always concerned about him. And in the end, he died of cirrhosis of the liver. And it's the same with close friends who I feel I can free to tell them, and I can tell them, why are you drinking so much? So, I'm talking about in these terms where you do feel for the person, and it doesn't matter to you if they get hurt, but you're saying it because it's good for them and it's not a nice thing.
You see, if your purpose is to correct someone, then if you're going to hurt that person, it's not going to take you anywhere. It's not just venting out your frustration or disappointment or anger on the other person. That is, I would say, not the right approach. The right approach is that you become a well-wisher of that person, and you would really like that person to give up something that he is doing bad or she is doing bad. And this can only happen if you learn the art of criticism. If you learn the art of criticism, and let me also tell you that at the base of this art lies the biggest human virtue, and that is patience. Patience cannot, you cannot be critical in the right sense unless you have patience. So you have to be patient, you have to be forgoing, And also, you need to understand that you have done your bit, you have done your job once you have told the other person that he or she is doing wrong. He or she is now an adult. He or she knows what's going on. He is or she is answerable to the Almighty Himself. If you keep on pestering him, if you keep on criticizing that person off and on, it's going to ruin your relationship with that person. It's going to ruin whatever you wanted to set right, and you'll end up a person who is simply become more drawn away from your own close ones. So I would say that we have to exercise caution and as well as wisdom in all these matters, and also realize the fact that the Almighty has not sent us to be people who have to vent our frustration or disappointment or anger on other people because we think that they're doing wrong. This is not the right thing. What we need to do is that we have to be very gentle, very soft, and make the other person realize that we are his friends. And if a friend is saying something, it is, of course, something which is in good faith. And as also, the friend who is giving this counsel must realize that once is enough at times. If you do it with grown ups time and time again, it's not going to be helpful at all. You have to be patient and let the other person think about it, contemplate about it. And if he still thinks that he is doing what he's doing and he's right in his doing, or maybe uh, he's not disciplined enough to give it up, that is his choice, which the Almighty has given him. And let he and his Almighty take care of this matter. We are no ones except people who can suggest, except people who can really counsel, and that too in a very humble way, in a very soft tone.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So I think we don't have any further questions regarding this session. I'm going to now move on to the next session, dear viewers. And this session, of course, relates to a common misconception. So the misconception that I'm going to discuss today, and let me also please request you to mute your mics because some of the mics don't seem to be muted, and we do have this background disturbance. Kindly have your mics muted. Okay, so the misconception, my dear viewers, that I'm going to discuss today relates to a very common question that we receive every now and then, and this is something which has become an almost a very regular feature. So people often ask that as far as zakat is concerned, can we give zakat to non-Muslims or not? And since the general answer which we get is that zakat cannot be given to non-Muslims, in fact, there is this elaborate speech which people make, and that is that zakat can only be given to Muslims, whereas sadaqat can be given to non-Muslims. Wherever they have made this distinction from, I simply have no idea. But let me give you the view of the Quran and the Prophet himself. There is not a single verse of the Quran, there is not a single hadith of the Prophet which says that zakat can be given to Muslims only, or it cannot be given to non-Muslims, or it is faith specific. Zakat, if it is meant to help people, the Quran and the Hadith clearly say that it is regardless of faith. In fact, it is dependent on the need of a person. So you can see that as far as the Quran is concerned, the verse, which is of course the famous verse which spells out the heads of zakat, is verse 60 of Surah Tawbah, which is the ninth surah. You can pick up any good translation of the Quran after this session, and you will just go through it. You'll find out this verse starts in a way, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينِ, and it then goes on to spell out various heads of zakat, with saying that zakat is meant for the poor and the needy and the destitute, etc., etc. Nowhere in this verse does it say that the destitute or the needy or the person who is in trouble has to be a Muslim. There is not a single citation that zakat is, in fact, meant for Muslims only. Now, you can ask this question that then, if this is such a clear injunction of the Quran, then why has this misconception arisen that zakat cannot be given to non-Muslims? Uh, again, as is often the case, there is a narrative of the Prophet which is entirely different, which has an entirely different context. which is generally thought of as telling us that we cannot give zakat to non-Muslims. So this narrative says that the Prophet was once sending Muaz ibn Jabal to Yemen. We know that Yemen was a part of which became part of the Muslim Empire in the times of the Prophet. So Muaz ibn Jabal was sent there as the governor of Yemen, and while he was going there, the Prophet gave him certain directives. He counseled him, he advised him, and during one of these directives, while telling what Muaz should do there, he says that you have to collect zakat from people there. And the words that are which the Arabic hadiths which they have cited is tu'khazu min aghniyaihim wa turaddu ala fuqaraihim, which when translated literally mean that you have to take zakat from their rich and return it to their poor. So if you interpret these words in the very manner I've spoken them, they would perhaps give you this impression that that we are being told that you have to. Let me repeat the word. It says tu'khazu min aghniyaihim wa turaddu ala fuqaraihim. Take zakat from their poor, from their rich, wa turaddu ala fuqaraihim, and return them to their poor. So from these words, it has been gathered that perhaps what is being said here is that you take zakat from their rich people and to return it to their poor people, and the word there actually signifying the fact that it refers to Muslim. So this is absolutely not the case here. If you study the context of the verse, it actually means that what the Prophet is telling them is that in those times, zakat was collected by these zakat collectors, and they were called the mutasaddiqeen. And these mutasaddiqeen would used to go and collect zakat from the people, and they are actually told that this zakat is going to be collected from the society, from you people, and it is going to be returned to you people. It is not that the state is going to keep it themselves or maybe exploit that money or use it for some other purpose, or it's going to be pocketed by the mutasaddiqeen or the zakat collectors. On the other hand, what it says is that the zakat shall be collected by the people who are in front of them, the society, and it's going to return to the society. There is no specification as far as zakat being given here is concerned to particularly Muslim society, the Muslim people here. And the word turaddu ala fuqaraihim, him, the pronoun him actually has been perhaps the cause of this misconception that it is perhaps meant that zakat has to be returned to the poor who are Muslims. As I said, this is something not only which is against the Quran, if it is interpreted thus, it is also against the context of the narrative in which Muaz ibn Jabal was sent to Yemen vis-a-vis this directive. So if we understand the Quran, if we interpret this narrative in the light of the Quran, we can clearly see that there is no prohibition of giving zakat to non-Muslims. In fact, what is actually required is that we have to see the need of the people, regardless of the faith that they are in. It is the need, the person who is in need, he could be any person. We have to be the person who is going to help out that person regardless of the need. So this is a small misconception which has in fact become a very common one, and people often ask this question that they often are in a fix, in fact, that if zakat cannot be given to non-Muslims, then what else can be done if we see a non-Muslim in a state of bother? So let me tell you that in the times of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he himself and the Khulafai Rashidun, their own public treasury was used for the benefit of non-Muslims. All the money of zakat which was collected by the state, not only through zakat, but also through other means, like for example, the spoils of war or some other in some other cases. But it was all brought in one place, and from that place it was dispersed for the welfare of the society, whether for Muslims or non-Muslims. And then, of course, there were areas in which specifically non-Muslims, to win their favor, to win their allegiance, to win their obedience, zakat money was spent to keep them quiet at times at the borders, so that they would not launch an onslaught and indulge in these skirmishes. So, just summing up, I can conclude by saying that zakat can be given to non-Muslims It can be given to Muslims. In fact, it is a non-issue to even think whether the faith of a person is under question or not whenever you're spending on a person vis-a-vis zakat. It is not the faith that has to be given importance. It is primarily the need of that person which has to be taken care of. The Quran, as I said, has made no distinction. It has not said that only the poor from the Muslims or the poor from the followers of the Prophet are to be given zakat. It has made no such distinction. And as I said, the cause of this misconception is a misinterpretation from a narrative of the Prophet, in which people thought that he is actually telling Muaz ibn Jabal to collect the zakat from rich Muslims and return it to the poor Muslims. This narrative, of course, has a different context and a background, which I've just attempted to explain. And viewers, with this, we come to the end of this second segment as well. And we now have time for your questions. And please let me know if you have any questions. I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. So I can see a hand, Rafia Khwaja, probably. So please unmute your mic if you have a question. Rafia Khwaja Sahiba.
Shehzad, I wanted to ask you that as far as namaz is concerned, what are the essential things we have to say in Arabic? And can we say some of the rest in our own, in Urdu? So if you could just guide me. I understand the certain things which must be said in Arabic in namaz.
So it's according to the research of my teacher, Javed Ahmed Hamidi. I just enumerate those things according to his research, according to him. The beginning of the namaz, which of course is Allahu Akbar, and subsequently, whenever you say Allahu Akbar, has to be in Arabic. Then the Surah Fatiha has to be in Arabic, of course. The part of the Quran that you read has to be in Arabic. Then Sami Allahu liman hamida has to be in Arabic. And finally, when you say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, that is to be in Arabic. All the rest has been left to our own discretion. We can pray in our own language. We can pray using various supplications of the Prophet himself. But these are the obligatory parts of the prayer. And we have to say them, these obligatory parts, in Arabic. So as far as other parts are concerned, for example, when we go into ruku or sujood, we can make dua, we can speak in our own language. Subhana Rabbiyal Azim and Subhana Rabbiyal Ala are the two expressions that we often use in kneeling and prostration, but you can say other duas as well in even your own language. Then while you're sitting in the Attahiyat, that's a completely routine sitting Attahiyat in which you can speak your own heart out to the Almighty in your own language. And of course, you can use the language of Arabic as well, but that's not compulsory to say it in Arabic. The compulsory parts, as I said, are just Allahu Akbar, Surah Fatiha, adding the Surah of the Quran, and saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. All the rest are left to our own discretion and to our own language. And of course, when I say our own discretion, it means that these are, or in all other places, we can make dua to the Almighty.
You may not be able to see, there's another hand raised down below, so you may need to expand your attendee window. So
Okay.
if you could drag it down, you'll see
Yes,
Yasin has a question.
Yes, I have. I can see her now. So I am trying to unmute the mic. It says self-muted. Yes, I think it's
Assalamu alaikum.
so. I think kindly unmute your mic.
Yes, I did. I think we were just playing tag because when I unmuted, you muted, and so it's okay. I just wanted to ask that you mentioned that somehow it was interpreted that sadaqah can be given to non-Muslims and zakat to Muslims. So, I mean, is there a real difference between sadaqah and zakat? Because I thought zakat was a form of sadaqah as well. So where did this difference came from?
Actually, this difference has
arisen because of our own understanding. As far as the Quran is concerned, these two are used interchangeably. And the words of zakat and sadaqah is exactly the same. However, what distinction that can be made is that the essential part of sadaqah is zakat, or in other words, the mandatory part of sadaqah is zakat. So the 2.5% that you give is called zakat. Other than that, zakat is just a subset of sadaqah. Everything is sadaqah, but the 2.5% that you give as an obligation is zakat.
So where did they interpret this from? Because even if you look at the narration that you give, it doesn't distinguishes between sadaqah and zakat. So how did the scholars or the ummah got that notion that sadaqah is okay and zakat is not?
so there are a number of things which do not have,
So to speak, an origin. They just go in the label of Islam, and it's like listening to what our forefathers used to say right from earlier times. So this is one of the things that I've not been able to trace out, that where did this concept or notion come from, that the zakat is only meant for Muslims and sadaqah is not meant for them. So this is something that needs to be traced out as far as I'm concerned. But as I said, the real purpose or the real cause of this misconception is that narrative of the Prophet, in which seemingly he is telling Mu'adh ibn Jabal to collect the zakat from the rich Muslims and to return it to the poor Muslims. So the basic issue or the basic misconception is that narrative, and I think that that needs to be explained. And if I also, let me tell you that we cannot accept any narrative which is against the Quran. We cannot accept any interpretation of a narrative which is against the Quran. If the Quran has not made any
distinction of,
discrimination between Muslims and non-Muslims, because you see, it has spelled out the heads of zakat. Verse 60 of Surah Tawbah, verse 9, which is Surah 9, you can look it up later on. You can see when you read that verse that if there had to be this distinction, this discrimination, the Quran should have said that zakat or sadaqat are only meant for Muslim beggars or Muslim poor, etc. It never said that. And that is why we find that the Quran is concerned, there is no such discrepancy. Or this misconception has arisen because that particular hadith has been interpreted in a certain way.
Yeah, because even if we look at the hadith, it doesn't say rich Muslims or poor Muslims. It just says rich and poor. So how do we,
Yes,
or
that's
how
it.
did the
Who,
people?
because you see, in aghniya in him, which means gather wealth from their rich and return it to their poor. So the pronoun there is interpreted by our scholars as if it is referring to Muslims.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Shehzad Sahab, you'll also see, besides hands, you'll see a question mark next to a name. So if you see next to Mateen Tahir Sahab, you'll see a question mark.
Okay. Yes, I do.
So that would mean that on your right-hand side in the control panel, in the questions tab, there is a question waiting.
There is a question written. Is it?
Yes. In the questions tab on your control panel, if you expand it, you will see a question
Okay.
there from him.
Okay. So what I can barely read is that, can zakat be given for the purpose of dawa work? Yeah. You see, you need to understand that zakat can be given for the cause of religion and public welfare. When the words of the Quran at the end, after spelling out various heads of the zakat, are fi sabilillah. Fi sabilillah means anything which is for the welfare of the people as well as for the religion that they follow. So zakat fi sabilillah is that it means that you can give zakat for the cause of dawah work. For example, if there is an institute running which is teaching Islam or maybe doing research on Islam or doing dawah work on Islam, It could be an institute, it could be a person, it could be an enterprise, it could be anything. So yes, my answer is that you can give zakat for dawah work. So does that mean that we no longer have any more questions?
You do not.
Okay. So I think that we will end our session here. Thank you very much, inshallah, and see you next time, same day next week. Until then, it is Khuda Hafiz.